Welcome back. Once again, Chapter 5, this time Scene 4 of The Use and Abuse of Laura Endicott. It is my professional consideration that Sir Hugh Montfort died at his own hand. This from the surgeon who had been called in by the police inspector, who in turn had been called in by the county constabulary, who in turn had been called in by me. The inspector shook his head slowly. I wonder. He was not left-handed, is that correct? Only Hargreaves could answer to this, since I had in fact never noted the scope of the knight's dexterity. He was not, but I have seen him shooting pheasant with both pistols of this brace at the once. How interesting, a little odd, perhaps. Now that he has passed, sir, I dare speak only that Sir Hugh was at times a bit of a showman. He was in cabinet, as I suppose you are aware. Only dimly. Politics is not my line, you understand. The physician had completed his examination. He looked over at the inspector. Yes, you may have him taken away. There is nothing more to be gained from the body itself. I do, however, have a number of questions, with the first being, apropos, as it were, did he always sleep in a state of complete undress? I blinked at that, and of course, given his lack of enthusiasm regarding myself, there was no way I could answer to that. Then again, if I had provided an answer, I would myself become implicated in an entire series of distasteful speculations. Once again, Hargreaves. Of that I would not be able to say, sir. I imagine that with all of this linen and silk thrown round here, he may have overheated. The inspector cocked one eyebrow in the direction of the manager. He then turned and opened up the armoire, which lay up against the far wall. No, this is too small a space. The bath? Clearly, given that the door was of course locked when Hargreaves and I had arrived, the inspector was attempting to ascertain if anyone could have in fact remained within the bounds of Sir Hugh's bedchamber and bath, while the two of us were both gaining entry, and then standing by his bedside, shocked into a not quite reverential silence. I had not even imagined such a possibility, and I quickly glanced over at Hargreaves, who raised his brows at me in return. I dare say the bath is large enough to have sequestered a single person whilst the two of you entered and thenceforth discovered the body. Sequestered, but surely not actually concealed, I managed to reply. But did either of you check the premises of the bath? We had not. Our faces told as much, and the inspector sighed a little, making a few notes as he did so. I would put it before you that suicide is not necessarily the only option here, given this oversight. Now, young lady, I am not blaming you, nor yet you, Mr. Hargreaves, for such a person might well have had the other pistol to the pair in their possession. Would not an assassin have brought their own weapon, instead of relying upon finding one more or less by happenstance? I now put in. That is certainly plausible, but it could have been a member of the household itself, who knew of Sir Hugh's brace, and thus knew he kept it with him in these rooms. Is that not correct? Yes, sir, it was kept here at all times, with the exception of the recreation to which I alluded. Shooting birds with pistols was a gratuitous display of a dubious skill, I thought to myself, and spoke of some flaw in character, perhaps. But then I already well knew what Sir Hugh's dismal flaw was, or at least I thought I did. We cannot entirely dismiss an outsider, but if we are at all to entertain murder, and I am not saying that I have decided in such favor, let me be clear, I cannot at this point rule out anything. Indeed, if I were to fraudulently represent a suicide, I should very well avail myself of the tools at hand, as it were, even if I had myself brought my own. This made complete sense. It was beginning to be clear that Inspector Mudge was sharp enough, but just how clever would one need to be to arrange such a scene as Hargreaves and I had come upon? It was by now dawn, and I thanked my own self-discipline for having retired so early the previous evening, given that there was now no chance of adding to that sleep. The girls would have to be awakened and thence informed, and all of the rest of it, and none of this communication and the ensuing questioning that would also have to occur could be performed without the presence of the inspector himself. This would make an intimate moment impossible, either from a sentimental or conspiratorial point of view. Having established that the bath was indeed the only such place where a third person, that is, aside from the living presence of myself and Hargreaves, could have been during the crisis, intruder or no, the inspector motioned for all of us to retreat downstairs and take up residence in one of the large sitting rooms. I made to fetch the girls, but Mudge's sergeant was close behind me. I set my face, not sternly, of course, but as a mask of mundanity, in order to betray no emotional neediness. I knocked at Sarah's door first, and it was immediately opened. She was not dressed, and her eyes looked a little pink, her cheeks slightly waned, but she was none the less alert. I bade her dress, if not fully and formally, and then went through the same procedure with Olivia, who was not at all as cheery about being awakened so early in the morning. For her part, she must have been still been asleep, as it took some moments before she appeared at her bedchamber doorway, and then her mild glare of reproof further evidenced such a likelihood. The sergeant was himself taking the odd note, and from that I gathered he would have to report every minuscule moment to his superior. That said, I was making mental notes, in spite of my mild delirium condition. Was Sir Hugh of such a guilt-ridden mind that he would have taken his own life? Did he have some debilitating disease, perhaps, and had been recently informed by his own surgeon that there was no hope left to him? Did his wife's recent death prompt such an action, or had he some fear of blackmail, perhaps even from myself? I had, of course, initiated with clarity, and indeed alacrity, the offer of regular intimacies, which, in a different household, would have been scandalous alone, whether or not such intimacies ever occurred at all. Did this suggest to him that I knew of his lengthy tryst with his elder daughter, and if so, might he have feared that I would gradually, but inexorably, paint him into an untenable corner? "What is this about?" Olivia growled this out upon beholding the sergeant. "Please, Olivia, you and your sister. Oh, here you are. Thank you, Sarah." Sarah had embraced me with some passion. Dropping off, she eyed the sergeant with some impatience in her manner. The girls had dressed hurriedly and were not at all fit for public consumption in any standard context. That said, I realized with some small shame that I had never once berated them regarding their state of relative undress. They simply wore what they were comfortable wearing day in and day out. That, though seemingly trivial, might well have to be altered, given that Sarah was herself now mistress of the estate. By the time all of us were seated in the largest of the ground floor sitting rooms, with chef up and serving as much welcome tea and pastries, I counted 6 of us. I shivered a little, as the numbers associated with the estate upon my arrival had almost been cut in half. Cut down to half might be the more apt expression. "Miss Endicott, if you would," Hargreaves intoned solemnly. "Girls, Where is father?" Sarah then broke in. Olivia shook her head. "You have got to be joking. How could anyone have gotten in here?" Now the inspector, who had not taken a seat, shot her a questioning glance, but Olivia had halted, almost midstream. Her lips were parted and her mouth thus ajar. Her tousled mane of dark hair had overblown her brows and was now rushing over their tops in wonderful chaos. It had almost seemed as if overnight the girl had become a young woman, but I knew that adolescence was like that. It had happened to me, way back at Hilliard's, which indeed had been a pleasant thing, given all of the opportunities to become acquainted with other like girls, my student peers, that had ensued. "Girls, I am without words in my sorrow to have to report that your father is dead. Yes, for now appearances suggest that he has taken his own life, but the inspector has questions for all of us, as such a horrible event must be clarified and explicated to the best of mortal ability. All such questions need be asked now, so that there are none remaining for the world at large to ask." "Very well said, Miss Endicott." The inspector nodded his head to me. I studied the girl's expressions. Olivia, as expected, betrayed no emotion whatsoever. If anything, she was already bored by the proceedings, which had not yet begun. But Sarah's face was a confusion of mourning, terror, and even guilt, no doubt placing herself in blame's way for her imagined part in her father's fantasies. One fantasy fueling another, thought I to myself. "Well said, and indeed my first set of questions are for you. You are the daughter's governess, is that correct?" "Yes, I am." "And when did you arrive and take up this auspicious posting?" "Just over a month ago now." "A month? So I gather you were replacing someone." This was the first moment wherein I had to take up the darker arms of internecine loyalty. "It is my understanding that I am the first to occupy such a role." Hargreaves shifted in his chair, but recovered nicely. I saw out of the corner of my eye Sarah slump in her own seat, but in so doing I could not observe her sister at the same time. "I see. One moment, then. How were the 2 of you educated before the arrival of Miss Endicott?" I answered for them, as might be seen as proper. "They were tutored by their parents until said parties had exhausted their curricular knowledge." That could very well be the case, at least in theory. Sarah was now nodding, but Olivia had rolled her eyes, no doubt thinking that my first efforts at subterfuge were that of a rank amateur. "Understood. That makes sense to me. Now, I do note, Miss Endicott, Mr. Hargreaves, that while you are the 2 key staffers at ArleMont, there appears otherwise to be a distinct lack of servants in this establishment." I handed the baton to Hargreaves, but as I did so I noted Olivia with a smallish smirk on her Cupid's face. My gods, yes, I am now traveling in your direction, am I not? And just where does such a path ultimately lead? We are within an interregnum of domestic service interior to the great house, sir. Otherwise, Sir Hugh contracted for everything else, including the gardening and like tasks. An interregnum? Yes, sir. Our housemaid is on holiday to see her mother, who's ill. Sir Hugh was compassionate about such things, and when Lady Montfort passed, her own lady's maid took her leave, as her services were no longer required. I see. So aside from the cook, whom we have just saw and my sergeant has already interviewed, correct, Phipps? There is, in fact, no other staffer. That is so, sir. Thank you. Miss Endicott, I apologize for that small detour. In your month of residence, your impressions? This was not the kind of query I was expecting. It was far too abstract, and indeed impressionistic, to borrow the inspector's allusion. Well, it is a quiet household. I would like to almost say restrained. But this is commonplace among the noble classes, I take it. Certainly. I have heard it said. Your own pedigree, Miss Endicott. I am from Southampton. I lost my parents in the Round Oak accident. Oh, dear. My condolences to you. You must have been quite young, as that has gone more than 7 years. I was but 13 at the time. Oh, so you are not yet 21 at present. No, my birthday comes in May. I see. Well, your legal status seems to have little to do with your academic credentials, I presume. No, I would think not. I am a graduate of Cambridge, a baccalaureate in English literature. This was the first thing that seemed to make an impression, to use that term again, upon the inspector. His eyes expressed admiration. And so your chief role here as governess is tutoring. That is correct, though I am no specialist in the sciences. I have some capacity in discourse in general, but it is the arts which are front and center for me. I doubt, for example, that had ArleMont been the home of 2 sons, that I should be hired here, if you follow. No, indeed, I understand completely. Is it then your personal feeling, Miss Endicott, that boys and girls should be trained quite differently? Another odd query. I made to recover a response suitable to the inquiry, but then realized that it could make not a whit of difference. Insofar as our nation asks of them differing roles, yes, I would think so. Quite so. Very good. And how have you found your duties thus far? Mrs. Sarah and Olivia are exceptionally intelligent and well-mannered, and indeed test me daily with their intellectual acumen and knowledge of history, culture, and the arts. I find my duties light thereby, and perhaps this is the moment wherein I reassert my intention to stay on in my current capacity, if that is the will of the remaining family members. Now Sarah appeared to completely relax. Until that very instant I had had no idea how much my presence meant to her. I chided myself, but none too stringently, for the lie I had just told about the character of the girls, especially Olivia, could not be compared with the one I had already committed regarding my predecessor's supposed non-existence. That said, it was after all the case that she no longer existed. Of course, that was not at all the same thing. Miss Endicott, your whereabouts this past evening and overnight? Now came the question I had actually been expecting. Mudge was an expert. That much was clear. He had led me down a sunny path with routine queries about myself and my role at the estate, and now he had abruptly pointed me out. For all that, I knew someone like Olivia would have been paying the most rapt attention to the inspector's style, all the while giving no sign that she was doing so. I had retired early, right after Mr. Hargreaves and I had dined, which we do each evening together. It would have been merely 8 in the evening. I was awakened just after 1 in the morning, having slept that entire 5 hours, by what had sounded to me, in my fuzzy state, you understand, like a dull report. Thunder, at a distance, would give some idea of what I had thought I had heard. Thought? One is not fully awake in such circumstances. Indeed, I would have passed over it entirely had Mr. Hargreaves, some moments later, rapped at my door and let himself open it, asking after me. Was that not a liberty? A minute one, Inspector. Mr. Hargreaves and I have come to know one another well enough, and I have never been one to seek a replacement for my father. I thought it reasonable at this juncture to point straight back at the inspector, just to show I was made of stern enough stuff. His brows raised noticeably. Then, I had not intended any such insinuation, Miss Endicott, not at all, merely asking after whether or not such could be considered unusual, given circumstances at hand. Oh, yes, of course, my error, Inspector. Yes, it was unusual for him to open the door without me asking him in, certainly, but as events proved, it was utterly understandable. During this interlocution, I had expected Olivia to express her annoyance at me for my reference, but there had, in fact, been no reaction from her. I might well hear about it afterwards, of course. In the meanwhile, her sister had buried her head in her hands for a moment, and then I observed her literally shake herself off. Such an emotion would be put down to her own mourning, no doubt. Indeed, and then I proceeded to dress a little, and in a trice Mr. Hargreaves and I made our way to the master's bedchamber, for it was from thereabouts that Mr. Hargreaves imagined this noise had emanated. Imagined, Mr. Hargreaves? Yes, sir, I was actually shaken awake by it, so I knew it could not have come from without the house. I sleep not far from Sir Hugh's rooms in case he requires me, you understand. So you, far more so than Miss Endicott, might well place the location of the source of the sound you heard to greater advantage. That is so, sir. Very well. Then I suppose I could address the remainder of this set of queries to the both of you. You together stood at the door of Sir Hugh's rooms and then found them to be locked from the inside. That is correct, I began, looking over at Hargreaves, but he nodded me on. I myself did not fathom what to do. Of course we knocked, with ever greater vehemence, but there was no response. You then turned to Mr. Hargreaves for inspiration. Yes, not quite the word I would myself have used, but it serves. May I ask, since you are a minor authority in such matters, what term you prefer? Oh dear, I wondered if I had nettled Mudge, but it seemed from his features, which had turned the more mild, if not exactly beneficent, that he was genuinely interested in my response. I was merely hoping he was possessed of the logistical skill necessary to force the door. Such a term that might imply such would be rather reassurance. Ah, good. Reassurance, in that you were concerned that the two of you would prove unsuccessful in opening the door from the outside. Yes, precisely. And how, then, did you manage it? Now Hargreaves spoke up, to my great relief. I was astonished at how tense I had become, and I tried thusly to breathe more deeply and slowly, whilst not letting my attention flag. Well, sir, Miss Endicott and I effected entry by using one of her hairpins. I pushed it through the lock and rather pedantically moved the bolt along to the left with it. In the end, having had to keep up the pressure to the extent that I could feel enough friction to know where in fact the bolt was in its barrel, we produced some minor damage to the lock and door frame itself in our haste to gain said entry, which, to my observation, had been already repaired by the time I arrived. Yes, sir, but I thought that of no consequence, since we ourselves effected the damage in the first place. In other words, not some potential intruder or third party. Quite that, sir, yes. It was clear enough that Mudge had been mildly annoyed by our efforts, and I gave the manager a look of mock chagrin, just to lighten the load. In so doing, I happened to observe Olivia's own expression. It was that of a minatory minotaur. I dare say that may have been a liberty regarding the most precise investigation possible, but I shall pass over it. Now, then, what did you observe after you had made such entry? I again took it up, and I could tell Hargreaves was now just as relieved as I had so recently been by his interjection. At first I could see nothing, even with my candle, which was guttering by this time. I noted the clumps of linen and pillows strewn across the bed, then one larger hummock, which turned out to be Sir Hugh himself. I approached the bedside, and then I saw. I did shriek aloud, but just the once. My dear young lady, no one here or elsewhere would ever think you cowardly, I'm sure, and I have since seen what you saw, so there is no need for further description along those lines. The linens, however, you say strewn round. So I ask you now, might this be interpreted as signs of a struggle occurring previously to the fatal shot? Yes, it might well have been, but with whom then? One thing at a time, Miss Endicott. This is not a reproof, just an adjustment, according to proper procedure. I nodded my understanding, then realized that it was the first time I had nodded in such a diligent and obedient manner since I had been at Hilliard's, where such a style of nod, if you will, was the only kind permitted. There is no need for self-abasement. Mr. Hargreaves, may I turn to you for a moment? I suppose you have no means of telling the usual state of linen, pillows, sheets, and such like, of which Sir Hugh was tolerant. Not in the least, sir. I would myself suppose that such a state of affairs would be common to all who indeed sleep, no matter their breeding or bedding, sir. Quite so, of course, and yet Sir Hugh was very much not asleep when he took his own life. Good Lord. Indeed, sir, regrettable in every way that it is, at the same time I would venture that if one is indeed in such a state of agitation or resignation which would impel one to even consider suicide, the state of one's bed linen might not be a feature upon said one's future horizon, if you will. That was very well done, and I sought to give Hargreaves a look of approval simply along rhetorical lines. But this may have been a misstep even so, as the inspector might not interpret my look as strictly an academic one. I detect no tone of the sardonic in your reply, Mr. Hargreaves. Mudge had stated this, but there was an implicit interrogative all the same. For the life of me, I, who had been the top student on campus in English, could now not recall what the rhetorical term for such an elocution was. Well, well, perhaps we can be said to not be too concerned ourselves with such things as a chaos of linens and pillows. I did ask Dr. Hobbs if he thought that the body, after being so fatally wounded, would have itself thrashed about to produce such a state, and he thought it highly unlikely. And so? This now from Olivia, the very first time she had spoken. I had wondered, at first idly, about just how long she would be willing to put up with the inspector's rather painstaking proceedings, and now I had my answer. Longer than I had expected, in fact. And so, young lady, this suggests that the state of affairs was produced before the shot occurred. The inspector had not quite glared at Olivia, but he had clearly been a little put out at what it could have been seen as her rudeness. My bed is an utter mess each morning I arise. This from Sarah, whom I could tell was struggling mightily, trying to present her usual chipper self. Her own presentation was an unmitigated disaster. Her otherwise perfect hair was tangled and misshapen, her eyes close to bloodshot now, though they had not been when I had awakened her, and her lips quivering, as if she had recently been beaten or the like. Knowing this was an impossibility, I then hesitated my stream of reflections. I dare say. The inspector had raised his eyebrows again. Then, you are Miss Sarah Montford? Yes. So I am led to believe that you are now the mistress of this estate, the new lady of ArleMont. I suppose that is the case. It is not of particular interest at this moment. I completely understand. Yes, quite so. Miss Montford, Miss Sarah, if I may, your nocturnal experiences, if you would. Her sister once again made an expression of impatience, but also evidenced that smirk again, no doubt because of the inspector's dubious choice of words just then. I slept through the night, to be awakened not long ago by Miss Endicott. I see. It is the case, I am told by Mr. Hargreaves, that you and your sister's rooms are located at a distance from your father's. Yes, for reasons of privacy. That is, the privacy of our parents. Yes, indeed, understood. Yes, that makes sense, of course. And your own privacy, was that ever in question in your family affairs? Now I was back straight up in my chair. Sarah's eyes had widened, and for a moment she was stuck. I never considered such a question. I suppose one might say in principle that the privacy of one's children is subject to certain limits. That is, until they come of age. Quite so. Yes, I would imagine that most parents would think as much. So, given that, did you ever feel that your slowly evolving privacies were sabotaged in any way? This time Sarah was more prepared to respond to such an unexpected line of inquiry. Not at all. One of the chief reasons I shall mourn my father's passing is that he respected fully the privacy of myself and my sister. I never had cause for complaint that either of our parents were overbearing in that sense. Indeed, very nice, most trusting of them. And in any other sense, then? What do you mean? What I mean is simply this. Were your parents overbearing in any other sense of the term, or effect thereby? No. Mother and father were as circumspect with their own affairs as they were with ours, such as the latter might be, given our respective ages. Of course, that is well thought out. How interesting. I suppose I need not reiterate this same question for you, Miss Olivia. My dear Inspector, my father was both a very public man, in so far as he was a noted public servant and lawmaker, and at once a very private one, in so far as my sister and I, at least, were never privy to either his work or indeed his thoughts. His death, however it may have been effected, must be worked along those lines, and those alone. What gives you the impression that I am working a specific line at all, young lady? Mudge had just proven that he was made of stronger than usual stuff. He had not only weathered Olivia's ambuscade, which had taken me flat aback in its direction and force, but returned the volley, as it were. I could tell Olivia had just managed to frame a response without an overlong pause. Your questions seemed to me to imply that there was a second person with my father at least some moments before his death, if not right at that moment. So, is your bed linen askew each morning upon awakening? Certainly. But then again, not having observed my father's bed, I could not gainsay that my notion of disorder would have either matched his own, superseded it, or made his look quite ordered by comparison. Perhaps we should make a tour of the entire house, in light of such pressing matters, and we can compare and contrast states of bedding to that effect. My dear sister, does this make sense to you? This last line was syrupy, but those previous had been declaimed quite matter-of-factly, which only underscored their utter sarcasm. I felt like Mudge could not have possibly ignored it, but in fact he did so, saying nothing in reply, and instead asked if Olivia had as well slept through the night. To the extent of my conscious awareness, I did so. This I did not doubt at all, given that she was barely awake when I had been compelled to get her out of the bed. Once again, however, the inspector ignored any potential barb in her response. Miss Sarah, is it your intention that Miss Endicott stay on? Yes. Certainly it is. Sarah had looked sincerely surprised at the query. I tried to let her response warm my heart, but for the moment I was unsure of its location. And as well Mr. Hargreaves, then? Good Lord, yes. Hargreaves has been with this family for generations. 3, yes? I thought I knew that. No, no, he is the pillar of our tiny community. Father would be dismayed, at the very least, if I sought to dispense with his presence, let alone his services. He is the estate manager, you understand, and I am not even 16. Without him, I could not possibly hope to run this place. Oh, not at all. Now Sarah had belatedly broken down, and though I moved rapidly to rescue her, her sister cut in front of me, and after giving me a cautionary look, held Sarah to her bosom until she had composed herself. I do apologize, Miss Sarah, for any consternation I may have caused. No, not at all, Inspector. You are doing your job, and I am sure all of us should express the utmost admiration for your acumen and attention to detail. The entire thing is both a shock and thus shocking, you must understand. There was no sign, then, of anything that may have led your father to either killing himself or being killed by another. This seemed rather raw, and for a moment Sarah was shivering again. I had seated myself once again with the sudden realization that although I was still governess, the fact that Sarah was now mistress of the place meant that I could no longer presume to have any authority whatsoever over her, and very likely as well over her sister. I was not privy to his innermost thoughts. My mother's recent death, yes, that is the only thing that outwardly might have made my father consider choosing his own. Were they close? No, not in my conscious lifetime. Perhaps early on they may have been, as many marriages go through such phases, I have been told. Indeed. Yes, Miss Endicott is a student of humanity. I needed to qualify this. The lady miss is correct to a point, Inspector, but I should be the first to note that while I have studied our shared condition, I have not yet had much time to actually experience it for myself. Quite so. Well said, Miss Endicott, and it does you no disservice in admitting such. Life can be long, at least for some, and there are always new lessons to be learned. Lady miss, yes, I suppose that is the technically correct term for your new station in said life, Miss Sarah. I care not about such minutiae. No, I dare say not. The Lady Miss Montford. Sounds like the name of a ship. Sarah, you steady old brick. Yes, my darling sister. Yes, I shall get through this, you and I. Quite so. Olivia had deliberately mimicked the inspector there. Inspector, unless you are willing to entertain my ideas of furthering this investigation, however amateurish they may be, I would hasten to suggest that the rest of today be spent as a family in mourning and preparing for the memorial, as I imagine that it will be even better attended than last week's. Olivia had gotten up and was utilizing her standard stance, with one hand on one hip and the other gesturing her suggestions. No, that was not right, for Olivia never had but mere suggestions. Sergeant, anything to add at this point? Just one thing, sir, if I may. Lady Miss, when you appeared at your bedroom door in response to Miss Endicott's knocking, you seemed like you had been awake, as you opened the door immediately. Yes, I was awake just before that point. And your countenance was dishevelled. Yes, it may have been. I have had some trouble of late with my eyes drying out during the night. I also tend to bury my face in my pillows with too much force, sleeping hard as I do. It tends to take me some time each morning before I am presentable, but today I was not given such leeway. I, too, had not failed to notice the utter disarray Sarah had effected in her presentation, and from the moment she had appeared before myself and the sergeant upstairs. That said, by now she had mustered at least her mental faculties, and thus provided reasonable responses to what otherwise might well have been taken for a suspicious entree. But I did not think it at all within even the realm of possibility that Sarah had herself anything to do with her father's death. My distinct impression had always been that she did indeed love her father, however flawed such an adoration must have been, and she had spoken such aloud and to my face of this love, and, as well, of how it had damned her, at least in her own eyes. Thank you, Lady Miss. Now Sarah betrayed some momentary astonishment. That set me on edge once again, but here were the inspector and his evidently capable assistant gathering themselves and taking their leave. It was Hargreaves who showed them out, and upon returning directed himself to me. Miss Endicott, this is not a wholesome task by any means, but I would require your aid in cleaning the master's room, given that we have no others to do so. Hargreaves, now that there are only the 4 of us within earshot, I commend to you an absolute assiduousness with anything you might discover that the official forces may have overlooked. With this statement, Sarah had unofficially assumed command of her ship to nod to yet another one of her sister's sardonic asides. Hargreaves actually bowed fully to her in informal but still serious acknowledgment of the passing of familial authority. I wondered for a moment if I should not at least dip to her, but decided against it. Yes, that, and, my good man, anything that said forces might have indeed noted, and thence left behind for us to stumble over, and thereby incriminating ourselves by removing such items, Olivia now added, her face an alchemy of intrigue and disdain alike. Smart, darling sister, oh, ever so smart. I am in your debt. Sarah was effusive, but Olivia gave her a look of reproof. Could it be, could it possibly be that those two had colluded, and were thus continuing their collusion? But the door had been locked from the inside. Could one of them have been hiding in the unsearched bath while Hargreaves and I had made the gruesome discovery, and thence had herself scurried away when he and I were sent scurrying for help, leaving the rooms unwatched? It was certainly possible, but was it plausible, let alone probable? Hargreaves, dearest old sir, I beg you stay with us now. More than at any time in my life, forgive me. I do need you in the utmost. Sarah had now turned to the manager and mate to shake his hand. For his part, Hargreaves bowed once again, though not as deeply, and said, My dear lady, miss, this is the very least I shall do for you, and for your sister. It is, after all, the only employ I have ever known, and I would never think to leave it, given the amount of years which may be left to me. I am the one who is grateful, nay, blessed, by your continuing loyalty to my presence. Be careful what you wish for, old chap, was Olivia's uninspirational contribution to an otherwise moving moment. I wish and want for nothing, Miss Olivia, other than what I have heretofore stated, he replied with dignity. Indeed, I had never observed Hargreaves to be the least aggrieved by Olivia's stentorian stanchions, her always less than mellifluous melodies. You want for nothing, my man, but is nothing what you need? I shall have need for nothingness, in fact, but only when the time comes. Once again Hargreaves had proven himself equal to Olivia's considered cant. Oh, dear me, I suppose father might have crossed his Rubicon. Such a passage, I dare say, such a rite of passage, makes of desire a necessity, and of mere want rather a desperate need. Olivia was not musing aloud for effect, and I realized just then that she never did so. No, this was directed over at her sister, who, having reassured Olivia that she was steady enough, could now thus be subjected to the same old torment as ever. But Sarah did not appear to take it so. Livy, for those like us want and need are indistinct. Desire is necessity, just as it is necessary for the human being to have desire in the first place. It would be your finest moment, darling beloved sister, if you began to love your own desires, now that your sister is freed of hers. Good Lord! My mouth was agape for a moment. I glanced quickly at Hargreaves, but in fact he had already made to begin what was to be a challenging chore. I hastened to join him upon the broad spiral stairwell, but I could not banish Olivia's last expression from my mind. She had been struck dumb by her sister's penetrating insight, and then, just as had Hargreaves acknowledged Sarah's novel authority over the estate, and thus all who remained within, so did Olivia, by curtsying fully and bowing her head to her sister. I had no idea Olivia even knew how to curtsy, so much so I had thought of her as only the darkest incarnation of the very desire her sister had exhorted her to express. Thank you for listening.